evening, everyone, and welcome to the International Centre for Sustainability, the ICfS. My name is Celia. I look after the operations here and the Director General's Affairs. So let me quickly introduce the ICfS to those of you who are new to the Centre. We are a registered charity think tank and just under 2 years old. We do research, peer-to-peer training, and policy advocacy work between the UK, US, and India corridor. In a nutshell, our job here really is to nudge the systems thinking approach towards sustainability. Within this, we have several different research verticals, from strengthening democracy, security, mutual dependence, AI, education, and the future of face. And before we get into the actual evening, let me briefly tell you about housekeeping rules. So please make sure you keep your phones on silent. You're more than welcome to take pictures, make sure your flash is turned off, and most importantly, make sure that we all look good in them. And just so you know, this event is being recorded, so it will be on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. For the toilets, just first on your right, 1 flight up of the stairs for the ladies, 2 flights up for the gents. And lastly, we're not expecting any fire alarms this evening. However, in case there is a fire alarm, please follow a member of staff and they will guide you outside. And now the part what we're all here for tonight. So the launch of our report on participatory and deliberative democracy in the digital age. We're looking at how citizen participation beyond elections can strengthen democracy in a changing digital landscape. The paper is authored by Dr. Pravar Petkar, our head of Strengthening Democracy desk, and we're here with Dr. Ansgar Koene, who is a global AI ethics and regulatory leader at EY, and I hope a proud ICfS fellow. And Simon Horton is chairing the session tonight. Simon has been teaching negotiation skills for 20 years, and he's been working with top companies such as Goldman Sachs, the Qatar Investment Authority, and the British Army. He's also been obsessed with AI for about the same amount of time, and his most recent book is called The End of Conflict. The End of Conflict is about the very positive things AI is doing in the world of conflict resolution and collaboration. So now over to you, Simon.
Fabulous. Thank you very much, Celia. Good evening, everybody. Hope you're all well, and welcome to this evening's discussion to mark the launch of the new briefing paper, Participatory and Deliberative Democracy in the Digital Age, which is very much about exploring what's going on in the world of deliberative democracy here in the UK and for beyond in the world, with a special emphasis on emerging technologies, perhaps especially AI, and how they might contribute to the field. As Celia said, my most recent book is called The End of Conflict, and it's about that intersection of AI and conflict resolution, dialogue, negotiation, democracy, all of those things where more than one person is involved with perhaps differing outcomes. And there are some very positive stories to come out from that. And one of the recurring themes of the book is AI and deliberative democracy. And there are some very promising stories there. Perhaps, finally, we may have a democracy worthy of its name. These days, democracy is once every 4 or 5 years, you have a vote between 2 equally bad options, and that's it. Well, maybe there are better ways of doing it, and maybe AI can contribute to it, and deliberative democracy. Those of you who are new to deliberative democracy, it's a way by which members of the general public can contribute to or even make decisions around policy. And so a famous example was in 2016 in Ireland, where a citizens' assembly was held, where 100 people, randomly selected, were taken to discuss the topic of should abortion be allowed. You can imagine in Ireland that is a very explosive topic. It's part of the constitution that it's not allowed, or it was part of the constitution that it's not allowed, so it needed a constitution amendment. 100 people taken randomly, but representing the demography of the country, taken through a process, facilitated, expert input. At the end, they had a vote. 2/3 majority voted for it. Shortly, that recommendation was then put to the government. They then had a referendum, and a 2/3 majority in the country in the referendum voted that it should be allowed, and the amendment to the constitution was made. The vote in the national referendum was identical to within 1% of the vote within the Citizens' Assembly. But also what was really interesting in the Citizens' Assembly was that 2/3 voted for it, 1/6 voted against, and 1/6 abstained. But even the 6 that voted against it supported it. They said this was a fair process. My opinions were taken into account. I was heard, it was taken into consideration, and I'm going to support this. Plus, such a divisive topic, if it was discussed on the internet, on X or wherever, the whole internet would explode. But this was a very positive experience. Everybody described it as a very positive experience. And at the end, all kinds of hugs and new best friends and everything. And everybody said that they wanted to be more engaged in civic dialogue moving forward. So Citizens' Assembly seems to be a very positive method. It has its issues, namely it's difficult to scale up, it's difficult to find full representation of the demography, it's expensive, and it can take a long time. The promise is that AI might be able to solve those issues, and there are certainly examples out there in the world where it has worked very, very effectively. But it's a young technology, it's certainly not proven, it has its issues, it has its risks, and that's basically what we're going to be exploring this evening. We're very lucky to have two very distinguished experts on our panel, Dr. Pravar Petkar and Dr. Ansgar Koene. Can I ask, hands up who knows Pravar and Ansgar? Several people don't. Okay, so what I'll do is, because Celia did introduce them, but I'll go into just a little bit more detail about the bios. So Pravar, many of you might know, head of the Strengthening Democracy Desk here at the ICfS. His research covers participatory and deliberative democracy, federalism, issues of political legitimacy, and the relationships between democracy, education, and emerging technology. He holds a PhD from the University of Edinburgh, in which he developed a new conceptual framing that illuminates the growing significance of participatory democracy in the UK. And Dr. Ansgar Koene, a fellow here at the ICfS and the global AI ethics and regulatory leader at EY. Ansgar engages with policy developments around the governance and regulation of AI, working with policymakers, regulators, industry leaders, and other stakeholders to support the trustworthy use of AI for the benefit of people, society, and organizations. Prior to joining AY, he worked as a multidisciplinary research scientist with peer-reviewed academic publications on topics including governance of digital technologies, data privacy, ethics, technology standards, robotics, computational neuroscience, and experimental human behavior studies. He holds an MSc from Delft University of Technology and a PhD from Utrecht University. So let's get the ball rolling. Pravar, I'm going to start with you. Why did you write this paper on deliberative democracy, and what were your main findings?
Sure. Well, thanks, Simon. Thanks to all of you for being here this evening. I appreciate that London in February, the weather is pretty awful, so some level of commitment. Why deliberative democracy? I think Simon set out a little bit of the background quite nicely, but I want to take that further and touch on a couple of things. There's a striking quote that really comes to my mind whenever I think about the way in which British democracy works, and it's from Vernon Boltoner, the political scientist. A few years ago he said, British democracy is of the people, it's for the people, but it's not actually by the people. And what he's doing there is pointing to this gap in our structure. Beyond elections, we don't really have these opportunities to engage. But also in a climate of democratic disaffection. The Pew Research Centre study from 2024 that we mentioned in the paper highlights that the UK, I think, amongst 12 wealthy countries, has had the sharpest decline in trust in democracy. More interestingly, and perhaps more worryingly, Ipsos polling that was released last month and featured quite nicely in the FT, there was an article by Andy Haldane, states that I think 1 in 5 people in the UK don't think that government is working effectively. 56% don't think that Parliament is working as it should be. So we've clearly got problems. And the UK obviously is not the only country that has problems. There are other democracies in the world with similar structural challenges. India is but one, but that's a different story. How then do we actually deal with it? We think participatory and deliberative democracy is a good thing to explore. You're bringing in a much wider majority of people. You're bringing in much more people into decision making. And I think the deliberative aspect is critical. Those processes of reason giving through citizens' assemblies, through other means, are encouraging active dialogue between people. They're encouraging active listening. They're encouraging people who have different perspectives to come together, share those perspectives, and actually come to a common understanding about the issues in our society. That not only solves the model of democracy, but also, I think, creates the conditions to sustain that democracy going forward and help us deal with some of the challenges in the world. And there are challenges. I won't go through all of them because I think we'd be here all night and many will be familiar to you. But there's one that I do want to touch on, and that is this vexed issue of AI and how AI develops. One of the things that is going on at the moment and starting to build is the development of AI towards what some people have called artificial general intelligence. How soon we get there, in what format we get there, I think is open to discussion. But one of the almost worrying things about all of this is the way in which eventually, in perhaps one of the worst case scenarios, you have major tech corporations working with nation-state governments to take decisions on behalf of the public on the basis of whatever data they have at their disposal. In effect, disempowering us from decision-making about how our society operates. That's going to lead to massive job losses. That's going to lead to social disruption. It's going to lead to a whole series of problems for government. A, we need ways of resolving those issues. But B, even getting there itself, I think signals a little bit of a breakdown in our structures of democratic accountability. With all that in mind, I think the need to actually rethink how we do democracy has become more urgent than I think ever before. That, I suppose, is the theory, the practice, which is really what this paper is about. Looking at what are the opportunities and limitations of participatory and deliberative democracy. We look at case studies from the UK and elsewhere. It's by no means an exhaustive list, but it tries to isolate a couple of key themes that we think are of interest and of broader relevance. And we've come out with 3 major conclusions, 3 recommendations. First is that it is worth engaging in small-scale pilot processes of participatory and deliberative democracy with open source tech where that is beneficial and where that's helpful. We've got enough evidence, I think, as it is to know that these things do work. And you can see that with the number of projects that are coming up. The Home Affairs Select Committee is running a series of citizens' assemblies. There's projects going on elsewhere in the UK as well. What we don't yet have is an evidence base that is outside Europe and outside the West. Cost is a factor as well. For those decision makers who don't have access to the funding for a full in-person citizens' assembly with professional facilitation, then there needs to be some sort of alternative. We can't have a situation where they're completely shut out of that market. Open source, free-to-use technology like Polis, like Decadim, will help with that. Second, we want participatory and deliberative processes on specific issues situated close to decision makers. Specific issues because we want actionable outputs from all of these things. Close to decision makers because some of the examples that we look at suggest that actually where a decision maker is commissioning this, it gets baked into the decision-making process. The recommendations of that assembly are actually being used to shape what happens in policymaking. Compare that to, say, a more removed process where that may be less so the case or not necessarily the case. And the final one, the third recommendation, is the need for more independent evaluation of these things. Simon's really highlighted for us, I think, the high point of citizens' assemblies, the Irish case. When you look, I think, at more and more examples, the picture starts to become a bit more complex. There are great successes and there are slightly unfortunate failures as well. And I think the question that we have to ask is, how do we design these processes better? How do we ensure that deliberative quality is maintained? How do we ensure that participants are getting from these experiences the sort of cohesion, the openness, all these other things that we're striving for? How well are participants engaging with all of this? We need more research in this area to actually take that proof of concept and take that into different contexts. What about urban India? What about a multi-ethnic society? What about a conflict setting where you're going to get cultural differences that shape the way in which these processes operate? So I think with these three things, what I see going forward is a process of iteration, hopefully not only for the UK, but for other countries as well. That is important not just because of our current models of democracy, but actually I think for what's at stake in the long term. We need to strengthen our democratic culture. This is the means, I think, by which we start to move in that direction.
Brilliant, thank you, Pravar. And then sticking with that, so if it went smoothly and all of those evaluations, the recommendations coming out of them were then put into practice, and we found ways of really making this work, what's the vision? Yeah.
So I think it's a few things, and it's almost you could call it the normalization of deliberative democracy. Right now, I think we're still seeing it as, okay, it's this other way of doing things. Representative democracy is our default, and I don't think, by the way, that representative democracy is going to go away. Certainly not overnight, and certainly not on some issues. There is still value in having things decided by representatives at national and regional levels. But I think it will hopefully become more integrated into local processes, more integrated where necessary into some national processes, so particularly on morally controversial issues. I think one of the unfortunate things about the assisted dying process, the assisted dying bill that's in the UK at the moment, is that there was a small citizens' jury conducted by the Nuffield Council of Bioethics, really valuable, but the fact that this came through as a private member's bill meant that it wasn't able to integrate into the decision-making process, which is unfortunate because I think this is the classic case where you would want something like this to actually get a wider range of people's views. So integrated into all systems at various levels, and I think also taken outside the government decision-making context. There is no reason, I think, why trade unions couldn't adopt something like this. There's no reason, I think, why students' unions couldn't adopt something like this. So I think there's enormous potential here. And actually to shift from thinking about just deliberative democracy experiments to systems that have deliberative democracy baked in to a wider, more deliberative culture that has, I think, benefits across society.
Yeah, fabulous. Thank you. So Ansgar, you've heard the vision. From your ethics and regulatory perspective, what comes up for you about that? It's perhaps especially with the AI side of things.
Sure. So on the one hand, I think it's indisputable that we are in a time where democracy is under threat because of a lot of the ways in which discourse between various parties has moved into a contentious way of communicating with each other. And this has been pushed by the way in which our social media is driving discourse, feeding particular things at the top of recommender responses and those kinds of things. So that is something that is really calling for a new approach to how we are going to engage with a broader set of the population in the democratic process. From that point of view, I absolutely agree. We need to be exploring how can we make this kind of deliberative process something that can engage a broader set of the population. And so for that, the same kind of technology that in a way has caused the problem by engaging more people in a unmediated discourse is something where we need to look how can we use also insert something into this technology so we can get a better discourse. And we've seen some examples of how you can actually use AI or data analytics in order to clarify to people where do different positions stand and help people find common ground, which is something, for instance, that has been at the core of the process that Taiwan has been using, for instance. But at the same time, this technology also we're seeing can help people with getting more insights into the issues. I mean, the speed with which LLMs, ChatGPT, etc., have been picked up by people as a way of getting a quick answer to, what does this topic that I don't know anything about actually mean, is of course remarkable. It shows that people want this. Yeah. The quality of the responses sometimes leaves something to be desired, and one of the challenges there is the transparency behind the quality of these responses. How do we actually know what is the data that these responses are being fed on? And then the question is, if we're going to use those as part of the deliberative process, how do we make sure that we get a properly balanced response into that process? So that's one thing. How do we make sure that the technology is actually transparent enough so that we can evaluate how it is contributing to this? And part of that challenge is that this technology largely is being built by companies in-house that are not naturally transparent. I mean, companies are not democratic institutions, generally speaking. And how do we think about using a product generated by a non-democratic institution as a driving component for a democratic process? The other challenge is, and this is something that we've seen with the internet, including the social media, earlier on, when it was still sort of a smaller number of people using it, there was a lot of positivity about the potential that it might have. But as soon as it became something that more people were coming in, you could also see that you get more people who have an interest in manipulating the process, getting engaged, and then using it to shift opinions in a particular kind of way. So that is a potential risk if we are going to say we want to use the technology in order to make this deliberative democracy something that engages a larger part of the population. How do we make sure that we still manage the process sufficiently, especially as this, if we're using this technology to remove the need for it to be in the room, remove part of that human aspect, which, Simon, you mentioned, led to people at the end of the process saying, I actually, even if I didn't fully agree with the counterparty, I understand them as a human being now. Are we losing that if we're going to be moving to using digital technologies for this? So there is potential, there is a real problem that needs to be addressed, but we need to be careful with how we move forward with it. And from that point of view, I very much agree with Pravar's recommendation of having more pilot studies. Don't jump too quickly to a big scale kind of thing. We need to explore where are the real danger points, because that is something that we absolutely did not do in the social media kind of landscape.
Yeah. No, as you say, and as you say with the social media, it was a non-mediated discourse. Worse than that, because of the profit motive, it was optimized for disagreement, basically. Whereas hopefully these platforms can be optimized for agreement. The danger, one of the dangers, as you say, is that it might be like that now, but these technologies change as new interests, and Cory Doctorow has a famous word for that, which I can't use on the panel, but these things change, and they lose the integrity with time. So Pravar, what would you recommend? How would you like to see these issues being addressed or avoided or mitigated?
I think one of the really critical things here is what kind of technology are we using, when are we using it, where in different processes are we using it, because the technology that is there in this space, it's not just one type. We note in the paper that you've got everything from citizen input platforms. In some ways the most basic form of participatory technology is change.org, the petitions website that some of you might know of. But particularly within the AI space, you might have platforms that are predominantly designed to say, just cluster different viewpoints. And it stops there. And then once you've got that map of different viewpoints, that was used in the policy process in Taiwan for Uber regulation, then you perhaps go into another phase of in-person deliberation. That could happen. You might have a use of say something like remesh, which takes that and also does a bit more with those statements. I think you've spoken about that in your book. So you might use that for part or all of a process. There are even new models coming up that I think are being tested at the moment. AI facilitated deliberation, voice activated deliberation. And all of this, I think, requires more study, more understanding to figure out what are the benefits, what are the risks, what works, what doesn't work, and then actually creating a wider culture where decision makers can make informed choices on what do we use when. Actually, for this sort of thing, it's such a critical issue. Let's say we go back to the issue of assisted dying with a national citizens' assembly in the UK, and we actually say, well, we're not convinced that this particular set of technology is the best. Let's actually go and fund an in-person citizens' assembly because we think that is the best option. That, I think, for me, is still progress because we've made informed choices about where we actually use different methods. And again, it comes back to the fact that we need to do more and we need to research more and we need to understand more about this. And I think it's through that iterative process that we actually go from the sort of ideas side of this to actually developing what works here, what works there.
Who's going to do that evaluation?
That needs to be independent, I think. Independent researchers, independent research institutes, independent think tanks. I think they play a critical role. Academia will obviously play a role in that as well. But I think those institutions that are close enough to the ground, close enough to where decision making is actually happening, but also able to step back from that and say, okay, this has worked, this hasn't worked, doing that in a methodologically rigorous way.
Yeah.
Perhaps one thing to add to that, though, is we need to keep an eye on what it is that we're evaluating for. Because if we're going to evaluate the use of the technology purely as a case of it makes things more efficient because through this and this way we managed to cut costs, we didn't have so many facilitators, but we don't take as a key evaluating factor what was the original point of doing deliberative democracy, which is that people actually engage with the democratic process more in a more real way, that they come out of it saying, I feel democracy is something that I'm really part of. Then more efficiency isn't really getting us to where we want to be. So we need to be clear about the evaluation, what it is that we're evaluating against, because we're seeing it a lot in the AI space, that the way in which these technologies, their deployment is being evaluated is quite one-sided.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really look at the full picture of the human dimension behind it. And if we're talking about deliberative democracy, the human dimension is what it's all about.
And I think if I can just come in on that, I was struck when actually looking at some of the examples for this, the Newham Citizens Assembly, I think the one on greening the borough, which happened in 2020, mid-pandemic, most of the assembly actually took place on Zoom, I think. But one of the things that came out of the evaluation from that was, I think a vast majority of those who were involved in that assembly felt that, okay, we found this valuable, we would like to engage in this again. So I think it's metrics about deliberation, and how effective that deliberation is. And those may be qualitative assessments rather than necessarily numbers that we can stick on things, but also actually how it's shaping how empowered individuals feel, how empowered participants feel. And I might just add to that as well, something around how that translates into public awareness of the issues. We touch on it a little bit in the paper, but what are these participatory and deliberative processes doing in terms of engaging the wider public on the issues that they are talking about? Are they a conversation that's happening in a bubble here, or are they starting a conversation that ends up going all around them? So those I think are some of the things that we need to look at in practice.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to that, getting more widespread engagement in it. But I think that thing of people, what are we measuring? Are we measuring the human feeling, the subjective feeling of I feel part of this? I think is really important. In conflict resolution, a critical part of the success of an agreement is whether people feel they contributed to it, whether they feel they co-created that agreement. So very, very briefly, without going too down a rabbit hole, but for example, if we contrast the Northern Ireland Good Friday Agreement with the Oslo Accords, which took place around about the same time, the Northern Ireland Agreement really had citizens' input in what they wanted to see in the peace treaty, in the peace agreement, and it was that was a significant part of the success of the process, a process that nobody really thought was going to work. Contrast that with the Oslo Accords in Israel-Palestine, around about the same time. Great discussions in the room, an agreement that everybody within the room was very happy with. However, it was all done in secret. And so then, when it was then put to the different communities, the communities said, well, we don't want this. And so they never supported it, and so it died a death, tragically. So that ownership, I think, is a really important part of this. So, Pravar, how do we get more people involved in this? Every time I talk to anybody about this, I say, have you heard of citizens' assemblies? They go, no. And then when I talk to them about it, they go, wow, that's amazing. So how do we get more people supporting this, engaging this, pushing their local councils to have more and such like?
There's the golden question, really.
Yeah.
I think there's probably two aspects to this. One is awareness, and I think we can start by actually doing. And I touched on it a little bit earlier, but the wider public awareness around that assembly process, a knowledge that this assembly process is happening. One very, very live example, I think. The Home Affairs Select Committee has just commissioned, I think, 3 assemblies on immigration, looking at different parts of the country, small assemblies. At the very, very, very basic level, are we even aware of this on a public level? And some of this comes down to communications. It's government communications, it's local council communications. That is a whole area that needs to be looked at. And then I think, so that's public awareness, but also starting conversations with decision makers and actually being acutely aware of what are the barriers that they are facing. If I think about, say, city councils in the UK or small urban wards in India, how are you dealing with the fact that that decision maker might turn around and say, why do I even want to do this? I don't have the money to fix the potholes on my road. Potholes, I think we all feel are a major concern in this country and elsewhere at the moment. I don't even have the money to fix the potholes on my road. What benefit does this provide? And actually being able to give them those examples, that evidence base. So I think you have to go in at both levels. You need to convince the public that this is something worth looking at, this is something that is worth giving a go to, and I think that's where participant experiences from existing assemblies become so important, and engaging decision makers, understanding what are some of the concerns and trade-offs that they might have to make in making a decision whether to go forward with this.
Yeah. Ansgar, do you have any ideas how we can broaden the knowledge and awareness of this in the general public?
I think I'd actually pick up on the point that Pravar made earlier, which is it doesn't all have to be in the political space.
No.
It can also, if we make this something that happens in more of the spaces that people engage in at their work, with, for instance, with the labor unions, even at school, in the kind of decision making that goes on there in the university, etc. I mean, I was on one of the university councils. Nobody else my colleagues really thought about any of the issues that were being discussed, because it wasn't really, I mean, it got communicated through a newsletter that nobody read. So how do we even generate the idea of deliberative engagement with any kind of decision-making processes at an earlier kind of stage and make that more of a common way of thinking? There is, of course, the question, to what extent can this be, or should it be turbocharged by making it something intrinsically part of the decision-making process in a country? If we think of something like the referendums that are constantly happening in Switzerland, because that's the way their constitution works.
Yeah.
Of course, there is a more of a sense among the citizens of, I need to engage with the decision-making process because every couple of months I have to give a vote on something. To what extent is that something that should be thought about as well as part of this kind of a bigger picture of thinking, of getting people to think about democracy as something that isn't just you vote once every 4 years for something nebulous that you maybe don't even care about because you think all parties are the same.
Yeah, and if they have positive experiences, then they will start to take that as a normal embedded part of our life, of our society.
You proactively start to reach out and say, hey, why don't we have more engagement with this kind of decision-making process?
I've got a friend who lives in Basingstoke who is setting up his own citizens' assembly. He says he's got 4 people involved. 2 of whom are his parents, but it's starting, it's getting somewhere, kind of thing. So, and you were talking about different places outside of the councils and such like. The National Gallery is having one, and so maybe these kind of other non-governmental kind of organisations can have them, that people will take part of it from a completely different angle. And then get into it through those kinds of routes.
Can I just expand on the National Gallery example? So I think what this was is how does I think the one in Birmingham, if we're talking about the same thing, how you actually use that space. So museum usage in the UK, footfall is not particularly high. How do people actually want to engage with this public space, with this public resource? A small citizens' jury was convened, and I think by and large from the evaluations I've seen of that, quite successful, and it's actually maintained a sense of connection to that cultural artifact for some of the people who got involved. So I think that's one example of, outside the sort of traditional local council government space where some of these things can be tried out, and where we're starting to see some of the benefits.
But that example also raises the issue of representation and who is taking part in these, because the National Gallery, you might imagine, is a certain type of person that's being involved in that. Also in citizens' assemblies generally, given that they take up a lot of time, it tends to involve people at either end of their adult lives, kind of thing. How do we get beyond that? How do we resolve that issue to make it more representative?
So I think the first thing is just remembering that all of these citizens' assembly processes and similar processes that are partially technology driven are constituted by sortition. So at a threshold level, yes, you've got the solution that this is a randomly selected representative group of people. The problem is specifically the self-selection within that. And I think this, again, is where we come back to technology as an enabler. Some of the platforms, and I'm going to pick on, there's the Waves process in in Camden going on at the moment. An initial stage with a much wider audience using remesh, a second more deliberative stage with a smaller audience, third stage wider audience, fourth stage smaller audience. So actually having that opportunity to participate beyond the sort of close deliberative aspect in ways that more and more people can engage with, that don't require necessarily your entire weekend, if that is something that you can't commit to. And I think one important area, one looking a bit into the future with this, would be some sort of asynchronous engagement. I think it already exists in forms, but I just think of the potential, and I always come back to sort of slightly more urban tech equipped contexts here. Almost everybody has a smartphone in their pockets. Imagine if we were able to get to a point where you have something on your smartphone that allows you to engage in one of these processes. I don't think we're massively far away from it in terms of the technology development side of it, and yes, dealing with the risks and all of that. But I think it's that other part of it, actually recognizing that within the participatory and deliberative space there are so many options available, and that there are more ways than one, and more ways at the same time of getting people involved. So I think that is one strategy that could be tried, and I think we can see some good examples of that going on at the moment.
I think also getting back to the question about how can we get more at more levels these kinds of deliberative processes to happen, it's important to make it easy for the process to happen, and that is a space where technology has the potential to help. If doing this kind of process means that we've got to find somebody who can lead a session, etc., it means you're less likely to do it for a smaller kind of decision within your group or whatever it is. But if there is an easy technology that you may have used already in a different kind of context, and yet we can simply look to using that lowers the threshold to saying, let's find out what all of our members actually think about this. Let's get them involved in it. We don't need to do this top down and then hope that people aren't going to be completely unhappy with what we did.
So a new overlay on an existing platform that people are comfortable with. Yeah, nice. If it's AI, can it be gamed?
Everything can be gamed. There are, with AI, there are also, of course, many levels at which you are actually making still decisions that go into it. What is the data that you fed into the AI? Yeah. What is the optimization criterion that you've told AI this is the right answer and this is the wrong answer when you were training it?
Yes.
Those things are massively going to skew the way in which it's going to respond to the process. How are you using it within that process? Are you going to be using it just as an informative tool for the people as they're making the decision, or are you having it be something that guides people into the next stage? That's going to impact things. And so just saying, oh, well, we're using AI and we claim this as in general intelligent AI, that's not taking away responsibility for you're the one who decided to run this process and you shaped it in a particular way, and you need to be able to take responsibility for all of those stages and be aware of the fact that when you made that choice for using this particular AI with that particular user interface, etc., that each of these was a decision and that each decision had an impact on how things are going to run. It's become dangerously easy for people to reach out to certain of these technologies and say, I can grab this off the shelf and I'll just use this one. I didn't think about why am I using this one. It was the one that was easy to grab, not necessarily the one that was appropriate to the task, and those kinds of things. So it's important to raise awareness about where you're actually making decisions that are impacting the way in which the process is going to run.
And I think with all of those decisions about all of those factors, about the process, the platform, the data sets, even the questions to be discussed, the process, which experts are going to be used to input, etc., for trust in the process, for it to really have legitimacy, you've got to ask not just what's the question or which data set we're going to use, etc., but who decides that, and who decides that kind of thing, for it to be genuinely legitimate.
And I think with that, it's something that I came across whilst looking at some of the examples that are in the paper, is how that has operated in in-person citizen assemblies. Mm-hmm. So particularly, again, Ireland, but also, I think to an extent, the 2004 Citizens' Assembly on Electoral Reform in British Columbia, ultimately unsuccessful. Both had elements where not only did you just have the assembly process and independent experts coming in and facilitated deliberation and some recommendations at the end, but you had a committee of participants who are also playing a role in what are the conversation guidelines for the assembly, what are the decision-making processes, who are the experts who are being involved? Are we ensuring that we have experts actually from both sides, particularly on these sort of highly morally controversial issues? So I think it's not forgetting that part of process design and figuring out how does that translate from that more in-person context into a context where you're starting to use technology in some or all parts of that process as well. But I think that ability for participants to shape the process, it's something that, again, it's important. It needs to be looked at further, and for us to really develop stronger ideas of what that best practice is.
So I would love now to hear your question. I've been asking these questions for the panel. I want to hear your questions for the panel. So I'm going to open it up to the floor. Please do ask very difficult questions. Don't hold back. But short questions would be good, rather than some long preamble, and more question than comment. And if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself before you ask the question, would be great. So who would like to kick off with a question for the panel? Sam.
Hi, Sam Lewis, former intern here. I just wanted to ask that you said that you thought the main use for these citizen assemblies is for divisive social issues. I was just wondering if you thought there was a future for ideas of collective budgeting, as you've seen in local governments in Brazil in particular. I just thought, is that an avenue that should also be being explored?
Do you want me to take that now?
Yeah.
So I think main use on divisive social issues at the national level, in particular. I should clarify that. I think at local level, what we see is a lot of successful citizens' assemblies, mostly of the in-person variety, on more specific local issues. So actually a lot of them on town planning, on green spaces, have worked really, really well. And it's these locally relevant things that are important. In terms of participatory budgeting, in principle, yes. It's a slightly different model of process. And I think the precise extent of the amount of deliberation, the amount of participation, what's there on the table, is slightly different from citizens' assemblies. But in principle, I'd say, yes, something that should be explored. Unfortunately, beyond the scope of the paper that we've presented here this evening. So.
Ansgar, did you want to add anything to that? Or?
It's definitely something that is being trialed in various places, often at the more local level, which I think makes sense because it's often easier to bring the particular budget issue to the point where it's people who are voting onto that and engaging with it have clear insights into what goes on. Because I think if you're looking at national level budgets, there are a lot of dimensions and challenges that come into it, and I think probably most politicians would agree that the decisions that they are making there is not what they wanted, but it's sort of the least worst option that they could come to, and that can be difficult to bring it into the types of budget voting types of tools that at least I'm aware of so far. I don't actually know the Brazilian examples, of maybe they're doing something really cutting edge in that space. I'd love to hear more about that.
Thank you, Sam. Any other questions?
Hi, I'm David Wood, a fellow at the centre here. So there is an exercise in democracy in this country in 3 weeks' time. There is a by-election going to be taking place in Gorton and Denton. And for many people, it's a terribly frustrating experience because at all our elections, people feel they're not able to vote for who they would actually like to be elected because they're afraid that that will be a minority candidate and some other bad party is going to be elected instead. And I noticed that one of the parties in the country, the U Party of Jeremy Corbyn's already said, well, we would like to stand, but we daren't stand because we'll split the vote. So is there a way in which AI might help us bridge from this very unhappy situation when people generally can't vote for who they would like to vote for, to encourage a transition somehow, either to a proportional representation or at least maybe a discussion before the votes in which people as a whole can figure out via some online mediated system that they will end up with a candidate that have a stronger support and therefore the electors trust the process?
Okay, so I think this is about actually taking potentially deliberation and consensus formation into this specific electoral context, if I've understood the question correctly. In theory, I think yes. There is no reason why this sort of thing couldn't happen. But contextually, what you're then getting into is what are the structural factors of the electoral system that shape behaviour, and also who are the decision makers that we need to convince that this is an exercise worth doing. Your party, which is the new outfit that is led by Jeremy Corbyn and Zara Sultana, I believe they've decided to adopt participatory processes internally to determine their leadership, I think to determine candidates. I think in this particular issue, there's also an issue with timing. That, I suppose, raises the issue of where you're almost trying to create participation with other entities in the system that may not be as invested in it, which I think actually takes us back to the challenge of how do we persuade decision makers that this is a thing worth looking at, and B, I think looking at the specific context of a political party, what does participatory and deliberative democracy within a political party look like? So I think there's questions to be asked there about what methods could work, couldn't work, what's appropriate, what's not appropriate, based on the evidence that we've seen. Again, I think one thing I would just say is this is a context in which you need to be able to come to some sort of decision, and I think it has to shape the methods chosen.
I think this is an example where we've got, on the one hand, technological solutionism kind of thinking that would lead to say, okay, well, we can use the technology to ask across the different parties what is your first, second, and third preference, kind of, and then we can figure out what would actually get people the most, the kind of candidate to be put forward that would give them the most satisfaction in it, instead of just having the smallest party saying we'll pull out because obviously we're never going to get elected, but we're going to suck away voters from the lesser evil from our point of view. Where that kind of thinking collides with the reality of political egos, where certain, even if the algorithm says most people would be in favor of that one, certain politicians will say, well, I'm not going to pull out because I know that if I do stand, yes, maybe the vote does get split somewhat, but I still have a better chance of getting elected than the other guy does, so he's supposed to go and give up his spot. That's not something where the technology is going to give a solution. This is where we've got humans and an existing process, because the existing process isn't going to evaporate just because we've decided at a certain level that there would be a better way of doing it. So I think it does highlight some of the challenges where the technology-focused people are sometimes looking at it in a slightly myopic point of way of saying, well, if everybody uses the technology in the best kind of way, we would get this great outcome. But the reality is that not everybody wants to use it in the most positive kind of way. So we need to work in the context of reality of how do we make sure that when we do deploy the technology, it gives us a positive outcome even when certain parts don't want to constructively engage with it.
David,
Could I quickly follow up?
Yeah.
I think what we're trying to get is a situation in which people trust their politicians much more, instead of having a terrible adversarial situation in which everybody feels that they can't trust what's going on, and so they put their heads in the sand, or they end up with worse politics as a result. So my question is there evidence that when there is deliberative democracy between parties, when there's more of a coalition government, when there's more of a transferable vote situation, does that end up with more trust and more contented voters than highly combative, highly ego-driven politics as you've discussed, Ansgar? Because if I look around the OECD figures, which countries trust their politicians, it's a huge variance. Switzerland comes in at 82%, people trust their political structures. You get Luxembourg, Finland, Ireland and Norway doing well, up at above 60. And if you come down to the UK, it's 33%, in the US it's 30%, and that was a couple of years ago. It's probably got worse. So on the face of things, it would seem that adversarial politics drives distrust. But I wonder, have you got more evidence of this? Because that would seem to be a role that technology could play. Otherwise, it's fighting an uphill battle.
Sure. So I think in terms of is there concrete evidence, I think what we're looking at here is less so the sort of specific participatory and deliberative processes that we've been talking about, citizens' assemblies, participatory budgeting, deliberative polling, and more actually about a wider deliberative culture within our politics. And I think, to my mind, yes, do we want a wider deliberative culture within our politics? Yes, without a doubt. I think we can see where that adversarial system is leading us, but I think that then takes us down a whole different route about, how are political parties operating? What's the system in which they're operating? What are some of the structural considerations that they have to bear in mind, which is shaped by a whole series of things from history, the electoral system, legislative procedure, and I think really then takes you into the whole other part of the way in which democratic systems are operating. And I think one of the things that it's important to acknowledge is that whilst we should be doing more deliberation of all kinds, and we do want more participatory and deliberative processes, that in and of itself is not going to fix the entire system. It's one part of the solution, not the entirety.
So I'm going to pause there because we're running out of time, and Celia is going to tell me off if I don't pause. So I'm just going to finish by staying with the panel and asking you your closing remarks, either about the paper or about this evening's discussion or about the topic in general. What would you like to say? Perhaps I'll start with Ansgar.
Sure. So first of all, I think that this topic of deliberative democracy, how do we bring more people into this space and make it more of a constructive conversation that perhaps through the conversation also identifies and finds new solutions that were not on the table to begin with, is something that is crucial, especially in this kind of a time. And we do need to be thinking about which tools can we use in order to make this more of something that is happening in the wider space. And perhaps something that we didn't get on so much in the conversation is maybe thinking about this not just from the point of view of actual decisions that are being made, but also things on how the discourse about topics is running in our various types of media. So I think, just the core of, what today was about is very important. It is a challenging problem, but more thinking and more input from the wider community, let's make this a deliberative process, would be very much welcome.
Excellent, thank you, Ansgar. Pravar?
I think I'd echo Ansgar's comments, but also add that it is more thinking, more activity as well. Conversations about this are good up to a point, but how do we actually start doing that experimentation, learning from that experimentation? I think some of the most critical things are reducing the barriers to this, whether that is cost, whether that is ability to engage, depending on one's social circumstances, and then that question of what are we measuring? How are we ensuring that there is an objective evidence base from which different decision makers, different institutions can learn from all of this and keep doing and keep iterating and keep learning and keep doing and keep iterating and keep learning? Because I think it's in that practice that then comes out of all of this across various spheres that I think we're going to start to see the real changes.
Cool, excellent, thank you. I'm going to round off in a minute, but just to say firstly, thank you so much, Pravar and Ansgar. I learned tons today and really enjoyed the conversation. Can we all give a big round of applause for Pravar? And so we've had our expert input, we've had a certain amount of deliberation. Let's have a vote. AI-supported deliberative democracy, yes or no? Put your hands up if you think that AI-supported deliberative democracy is a good idea. Lots of people, put your hands up if you think it's not a good idea. A minority, the people have voted. We have a bright future. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm going to hand you over to Celia to finish up.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for coming this evening, and I promise I'll let you go very, very soon. So, as you all know, we are a charity, and if you want to support us, you can follow us on LinkedIn. So here's a lovely QR code. Make sure to scan it. And if you want to stay even closer to the center, engage more with us, more with our work, you can even consider becoming a member. So our membership gives you access to our private roundtables that we host here at the center and our Modern India Lab upstairs. It's a beautiful workspace and just on our ground floor. And I'm also very, very happy to announce that the ICfS is heading to New Delhi for the 2026 AI Impact Summit. Our session will be on harnessing AI for water resilience and sustainable growth. So stay tuned for that. And if you enjoyed your evening here with us tonight, our next event at the center will be our February K lecture. The February K lecture is on the 25th of February, same time as this evening, and it will be a conversation on interfaith and community cohesion, past, present, and future. So we will reflect on 2 decades of interfaith dialogue, explore its achievements and challenges, and consider how dialogue between Abrahamic and Dharmic traditions might move forward. So thank you again for being here, and please stay, chat, network, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Good night.